Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Rohit Kachroo.
Hello everyone, I'm Rohit Kachroo. I'm Global Security Editor for ITV in the UK. And it's a pleasure to be here to moderate this panel today, where we're going to be addressing some really key issues relating to hybrid war, relating to changes. And I also want to say right at the start that you all have the opportunity to ask questions, so please do, using the app. We have an esteemed panel today, and so I'd like to welcome them. Here they are. First of all, we have State Secretary Sorin-Dan, Moldovan. We have Pavel Fischer, the Committee on Foreign Affairs here in Czechia, Nicole Giles, who is from Canadian Intelligence Senior Assistant Deputy Director. We have Dhesi from the UK, who's on one of the Parliamentary Defence Committee as well. And I should also add that later on, we'll be joined by Elisabeth Braw from the Atlantic Council. She has succumbed to Prague traffic, but I'm told that she will be here. So let's all take a seat and let's begin this conversation. And please do go ahead and ask your questions in the meantime. But first of all, perhaps a good place to start would be to ask everyone here to reflect on the last 3 years since the invasion, the further invasion of Ukraine, which have focused so many minds in governments, in intelligence agencies, and in the general public in all of the countries that we come from. What has been your number one lesson from Ukraine from the last 3 years? Perhaps we start here to my left with Mr. State Secretary.
Well, it's an honor to be at this panel. And to answer your question, unfortunately, it's not about only Ukraine and lessons learned from the things that happen in Ukraine. Also, unfortunately, things are happening in Europe as well. And whether we're talking about hybrid threats, for example, these are a reality that are still in Europe, in European countries as well. And I want to take an example, as you all know and saw on TV, my country, Romania. We had to cancel the elections due to this. Russian interference in the elections. So again, what happened in other countries as well? Poland, for example, they also had elections everywhere. Germany, everywhere. So unfortunately, we are not learning only from Ukraine, what's happening in Ukraine. Of course, Ukraine, it's at another level because we have a war there, and not only hybrid threats, it's also a war. But in European countries as well, we have these kinds of hybrid threats. And I want to stress what the NATO Secretary General said a few days ago in London, that we are all on the eastern flank now. There is no longer east or west, there is just NATO. And I think this quote, which I think it describes the reality that we're living in. And I think all the politicians or the decision-making level, whether we're talking about political decision-making level or military decision-making level, should be aware of this. And I think the Secretary General, Mark Rutte, stressed that very, very clear.
And I'll come on to our other guests shortly, but I just want to take this opportunity to sort of drill down on that point, particularly, you know, the election recently is a firm example that offers us a kind of case study on what we're talking about. Tell me how that interference looked, and tell me how it felt to be in the system at that time.
Well, it happened just a few months ago, so it's not so long. They used a lot of fake news propaganda, and they used a lot of TikTok, for example. TikTok was one of the tools that Russian propaganda used to promote their candidate. And not only used by farms, by boot farms, but also they changed the algorithm. So they made the Russian candidate, the candidate that was supported by the Russians, to be very visible, and it was like in the 9th place in the world on TikTok. So
in terms of engagement and views.
Exactly. And of course, a lot of fake news, a lot of, for example, we have, and we still have now, these kind of things going on TikTok, mostly. I don't know, for example, we have exercises, military exercises with NATO partners, and they post on social media that, hey, we are going into the war with Russia. We are moving tanks to go to the border and fight with Russians. So a lot of these things that unfortunately are present in European countries as well. And it's not only in Romania, it's all over Europe, and mostly in the eastern flank.
And I'm sure we'll come back on to this topic in the Q&A, but I want to move on to Mr. Fischer. That same question. Tell me your number one lesson of the last few years.
Thank you for the challenge, because there are so many lessons that we have difficulties to put out one single. So for Ukraine, I would say resilience matters, and it exists, and we can admire how resilient is the defense of Ukrainians. And for us, I would say the time lapse from words and declarations to acts is painfully long, and we are in a situation that we should be aware of the imminent threat that Russia represents for us. And I think that the declarations are not always swiftly followed by action, and this is a very painful lesson learned that we should take for ourselves.
And to Nicole, Giles, your thoughts from the last 3 years, and have they opened eyes in Canada, or have they confirmed suspicions?
Well, certainly, and I think I'd expand the eastern flank being all of Europe to also bring in the transatlantic relationship as part of this as well, because we're also experiencing hybrid threats from Russia and then also China in a very real way. But I think I'd encapsulate our lessons learned from the last couple of years in one word, which is the importance of partnerships. That the nature of hybrid threats means that we're actually dealing with a broader set of national security partners where the targets are not just the federal or national governments, but it's industry, it's society, it's various ethnic, religious communities that are being targeted. And so we, as the government, require a much broader set of national security partners in order to be able to actually build that resiliency. It's not something we can do alone, and we also have a pretty profound obligation to protect the broader elements of our societies that are also being targeted. And then the way as well that we can do that best is with our international partners and our allies. So the work that we have done in terms of working with Ukraine to help ensure that we're doing capacity building, we're supplying equipment, we're sharing information and intelligence, that we require the partnerships in order to be mutually supportive of each other in combating this, because none of this is something that can be done in silos, and we have to work as a true alliance. And that means not leaving our partners hanging out to dry, but also being able to have the confidence that when we're experiencing threats, that we'll be able to learn from each other and that we can count on our partners to also come in and provide that support.
And how are you finding the challenges of, you know, the kind of political realignment and what you see to the south of your own border?
Well, I think it's been an opportunity to catalyze the minds of Canadians towards national security in a way that Canadians are generally not comfortable thinking about. We are the beneficiaries of our geography, which means we're a country of 3 oceans. And it means that we've had a bit of the luxury to be very inward-looking and to not have to think about national security in the way that we're now being forced to. So our Prime Minister is very much seeing this as an opportunity to invest more profoundly in national security, and it's an opportunity for us to step up, and that's what we're trying to do.
Okay, and before I ask the question to Dhesi, I just want to add that Elisabeth Braw from the Atlantic Council is about to join us. I think the Prague traffic has been a bit nicer and has allowed you to... and we'll come to you in just a moment, but to Tam, first of all, what from a UK perspective, from a parliamentary perspective, do you think the last 3 years in Ukraine have taught the British system and the British public?
Rohit, a pleasure to be here with all of you at the GlobSec Forum. In terms of Ukraine, there are so many lessons to be learned, whether it's in terms of their bravery, their resilience, their agility, having realized that they are faced with an adversary that's much larger, greater mass, they were able to adapt to the usage of drones and other technologies, which meant that they could then fight that good fight. One of the key things that I think is to learn is the usage of reserves. So they managed to harness the potential of wider society. That's something that our UK Defence Committee has also realised when we visited, for example, Estonia and Finland, Latvia recently, with how they are using total defence, their aspect of comprehensive security solutions using wider society. So I think that's the key thing to take away from Ukraine, is that they were able to use individuals with different skill sets, especially those with cyber skills, include those to engage in the fight. And that's something that the UK has learnt and has incorporated. So, for example, this month we've launched the UK Strategic Defence Review, and within that there is a component about having greater homeland resilience and the usage of greater reserves, increasing the number of reserves by 20%. So that's, I think, a key takeaway from me.
And the same question to Elisabeth. Lastly, what lessons to learn from the experience that the NATO allies and the world has had from this phase of the war in Ukraine?
Well, I'm speaking a little bit into the void since I didn't hear what else you discussed. But I think the bottom line is, in our Western societies, we are realizing how precious the construct is that we have built and previous generations have built over a number of decades, and how easy it is for that to slip away from us, whether as a result of aggression from a hostile state, or just because we are careless in not taking care of what we have built. And what the Ukrainians have shown, large chunks of the population, is dedication to their society. And I think we have it in our societies too. It may be tested at some point even more than it has been tested so far. But what we can see, what they have done is they've organized themselves, even when not called upon to do so by the government, simply because defending their country, protecting what they've built, is important to them. And I think it is important for us too, and to us too, when a crisis occurs, whether it be caused by internal mismanagement or external threats, or indeed by Mother Nature, that we will realize then how important our societies are to us, and we'll try to organize ourselves. And credit to the civil contingencies agencies, by the way, in a number of countries that are working so hard on a daily basis to find ways of setting up that command structure so that we don't have to organize ourselves during a crisis, which is what the Ukrainians have done so incredibly impressively. But if we can do a little bit beforehand, or indeed most of it beforehand, then we'll be better set up when a real crisis occurs.
Yeah, and so, I mean, thanks for all of your thoughts here. I just want to remind the audience that you can ask questions on Slido, and perhaps let's take our first one, which is, we're being asked, how can EU states enhance resilience against hybrid threats from Russia, like sabotage in Poland and Romania, without undermining democratic values? And it's an interesting question, and perhaps it's best to ask first you, Mr. State Secretary. I mean, what are your thoughts there?
Well, first, when we're talking about resilience, resilience must be built in peacetime, during peacetime. Ukraine's ability, for example, to resist was not improvised. It was a result of years of preparation. Second, I think strategic communication is a front line as well. For example, Romania has developed national Stratcom since 2018. And third, the defense of democracy requires a whole society effort, in my opinion. Whether we're talking about military or political or informational or civic, even civic. Because resilience requires choices. And I believe that governments, whether we are talking about Romania or Poland, but I believe this applies to all governments, must reconnect defense with society. That means that open communication about threats, you need to explain national for example, the national vulnerabilities that we have, the real requirements of deterrence. Maybe, I'm not saying maybe, it's a certainty actually. This is where, for example, we did that part, and we didn't see that coming, at least not on that level, because I believe Romanian elections were a test for Russia as well. I believe it was like a big test to see how they can interfere in European life, whether we're talking political, civic, or military. Because now we're not talking only about like a classical war. Now we have this hybrid threats, or things evolved together with the technology, because technology brings a lot of good with it, but also brings a lot, some vulnerabilities that we are facing. Take, for example, everybody has a phone. It's very useful. You can speak to the family, to the friends. You can have FaceTime them. You can see somebody dear from a long distance. But in the same time, you can be a vulnerability because that phone might be hacked. Cameras or microphone may be activated and spying on you and so on.
I want to bring Tan in there because you're nodding there.
Thank you very much, Rohit. Well, the question actually pertains to EU states. So while the UK is no longer an EU state, and I don't want to rerun the Brexit referendum here, but
you only have 27 minutes.
We'll need, I think, 27 years.
But still applies to UK.
It still applies to us. So look, there are several things in the UK that we've done. For example, we've got the National Cyber Security Centre. We've also instituted the National Cyber Force in the UK. And something else, that along with chairing the UK Defence Committee, I'm also a member of the UK Parliament's Joint committee on the national security strategy. Now, within that, we have been looking into the work of the Defending Democracy Task Force. I think in all of our nations, it's very, very important that we actually engage the public, bring the public along with us, because those of us who are either parliamentarians or those of us who are in the intelligence services or in academia, there's no point in just a few people at GlobSec Forum discussing it or people in Parliament discussing it. If we don't take the public along with us, we cannot implement any of our policies. So I think that, like what we've done in the UK, is to discuss this more widely on the floor of the House, as well as in media and in social media, to say these are the sort of threats that we are facing, and the UK is now the third most targeted nation on the planet in terms of cyber attacks. So the more we discuss it, the more the public will buy in, and the more that they will want us to invest.
And bringing the public with you is part of your brief, Nicole. So I wonder if I can bring you in there to answer that question of how you actually do that.
Well, I think a lot of it is in some ways certainly counter-instinctual for intelligence agencies, where we need to step out of the shadows and into the light. And so it's all about increasing transparency, both in terms of the threats that are being experienced and also in terms of how we can build our resilience to them. And I think where in some ways I'd actually flip the question on its head and say that by using transparency, we can actually empower our democratic values by empowering our citizens to be able to combat the threats that they're experiencing. And we've done that in a couple of ways, some very similar to approaches the UK has taken and our partners have taken, learning from each other. But part of that is for things such as we've recently gone through a federal election process, and for the first time ever, we had weekly technical briefs to the media in terms of what we've seen in terms of the threats, which was some very explicit mis and disinformation that was experienced. And just to be able to allow the public to protect themselves by being aware of the threat. And we've also had some pretty explicit campaigns in this area as well. So for example, we have a very snappily named pamphlet called Foreign Interference in You that allows Canadians to be able to identify what foreign interference looks like, which is what all of these hybrid threats are about, and then also to protect themselves against it. But critically there, to bring people along, we have it in 9 languages. So it's allowing us to communicate with the communities that are being targeted rather than just in our 2 official languages, English and French. So we have all the ones you would suspect. I'm sure the panelists could label them if we played a guessing game, but it would be in terms of, we have Farsi, Persian, Chinese, Russian, all the languages for the communities that are being targeted.
Perhaps, Pavel, you want to add to that? I mean, is there really friction in terms of democratic values and countering some of those hybrid threats?
Yes, I think that if we consider that it is not only about Ukraine, but also about other fields in the world which are under threat, I speak about not only Russia, but also China, for instance, we have to realize that we are in a very fragile situation in which technologies could be perverted and the public debate might be stifled. And I think that the role of parliaments is very important. We have immunity, so we can speak out. And by speaking out, we can push out and standing with the core values of our societies, backed by the constitutions, we can push out all those who would like to meddle in our internal affairs. We have very special experience here in Prague that I am ready to develop later on. But when the Russian aggression started and unfolded in 2022, we behind closed door started to discuss in our committee. We have security, defense and foreign relations together. So in these times it is extremely accurate to discuss this together. And we invited all the intelligence and military and other experts behind closed door. And we discussed with them the facts on the ground, our beliefs, our hopes, our fears, sometimes when listening to my colleagues, I said, oh, such a toxic information you bring here. This is very dangerous. But when our security establishment was challenged by this, they had to reply. And we succeeded to learn something that I would say strategic prudence and strategic communication. So the members of the committee didn't spread lies outside. They have understood behind closed doors that this is so complex that we have to be very disciplined. And by doing this, at the end of the day, we succeeded to bring on board also the public because we were cautious while speaking, and I think that strategic communication is of utmost importance these times.
I just want to open it up to more questions from the audience as well, and please contribute via the app. I'm going to take another question, which anyone can chip in on this one. You know, in a proliferating hybrid threat environment, we're being asked, where do you set the thresholds of what triggers a collective response? And maybe Tan, I go to you on that one first. What, like, you know, here is a challenge. At what point should a collective response be triggered?
First of all, I just want to build on what Pavel was just saying there. One of the staggering bits of fact that came across to us in our Defence Committee inquiry into defence in the grey zone was that by 2027, so within 2 years, 90% of the content on the internet will be fake or false. That is incredible. So that's just the level of threat. So how do we counter that collectively, whether that's NATO and so, that is very, very difficult, because when you're in the grey zone or in a hybrid threat environment, it's very difficult to apportion blame. It's sometimes, because things are happening beneath the threshold, whether it's, for example, in critical undersea infrastructure. So we're in the midst of an inquiry into how do we protect our critical underwater infrastructure. And a lot of that is just through not malicious acts, but accidental damage. But how do you call out somebody, and that they need to be called out, by the way, if we can, and that you cannot always apportion blame. And if you cannot do that as a matter of fact, then you cannot suddenly get collectively involved. And the other thing that we've got in terms of alliances, whether it's in NATO, whether it's in terms of EU, for NATO nations to act, not everybody will be of one opinion. So that collective response is not very easy. I believe you wanted to come in on this as well?
Yes, and it shouldn't start, the response should be the last step. So the first step should be to establish what the threshold is above which we consider grey zone aggression or hybrid threats unacceptable, because some things we'll just have to accept that they exist in our societies, continued cyber attacks and so forth, but above what level is it unacceptable? Or do we consider it to be unacceptable? And then we have to communicate that to adversaries and indeed to the public, because if the adversaries don't know that we consider it unacceptable, then of course they'll keep going. So the response is only the last step that happens if that communication, that deterrence messaging has failed. And on that note, if I can come back to the previous question, what we need, and I don't know if anybody here is in the position of appointing governments, well, I think we all are as voters, but anybody who's more responsible than others for appointing governments, what we need, I think in every single Western government is a minister who has as his or her brief civil defense, and that minister should be the best communicator in the government, because that minister needs to communicate to the public in our societies and to our adversaries what we are all about, so that when time comes to respond, to ask the public to do something, and indeed to ask the public to spend more money on defense, the public understand why that is necessary.
And perhaps I should bring in Nicole there on that point, and maybe with the next question here, which is about communication, and we're asked, you know, the term hybrid threat is often vague and perhaps downplays the impact. isn't it time we call some of these acts what they are, which, in the words of this questioner, is terrorism? And therefore, should we respond accordingly? I'm going to ask that to Nicole, and then perhaps, Pavel, you can chip in as well.
A couple of thoughts here. So the first, and just to pick up on your comment, is I think one of the reasons why it's so difficult to counter it is that these threats are playing just below the Article 5 threshold, which makes it very difficult for us to collectively respond. And that's not by accident. It's not that they're just magically playing right below that threshold. It's very purposeful to make it difficult for us to collectively respond. So I think part of one of the things we're trying to think through is if we do call out the threshold and identify where it is, will it have the impact of communicating to our adversaries the lines that they can't cross? Or will it enable them to continually play just below that line? And perhaps. So there's a constant dynamism to how those thresholds interplay and interact. It's certainly not something that's static. And I think a big part of it is naming it and is calling it out. We have to impose costs for these activities on our adversaries and on the countries. And a huge part of that is calling out the activities for what they are and doing that attribution as difficult as it can be. And that requires us as governments to perhaps accept a little more risk in that space.
And what do you think, Pavel? Because there is risk attached to that, isn't there? But is there also reward?
Yes, and I think that I will just develop what we heard, because operate under the Article 5 is a very smart way of proceeding, because you cannot exaggerate or escalate. But I think that the West should be ready to learn lessons from the Cold War, where we had this escalation psychological game between the powers during the Cold War, which succeeded to maintain a kind of status quo. Observe Moscow, it is escalating. We do not respond always on the same. And I think that this is something that we have to learn, because we live in a very dangerous world with a superpower which is escalating, and we do not reply in kind. But to the question, I think that hybrid threats, for me, is not only about terrorism. It is much larger. It is psychological warfare. It is operations aiming destabilize or disorient public opinion, instill distrust. And if we take this, it is much larger than only terrorism. And I think that we have to be really ready to also protect, for instance, elections. In this very country, we have elections soon. And people, if you ask them, do you fear that Russia would meddle in the elections? Only 1/3 reply that may be. But listen, there is a dangerous message from this, because more than 50% are convinced and believe in Czech Republic that the elections might be manipulated by the government. It was never like this. And this is probably very important to see. We live in the world in which citizens start to doubt about the rule of law and confidence and trust in public institutions.
Sorin-Dan, perhaps I can draw you in at that point.
I totally agree with what Pavel said, but that's true. That's basically the main thing that Russia is targeting, having citizens not trusting the public institutions and make them feel, that the government is stealing the elections. This was the narrative in Romania as well when the Constitutional Court decided to cancel the elections after the Supreme Security Council analyzed the threats and so on. So This happened to us in Romania, and I hope all the other countries, our NATO allies and our European allies, will learn from what happened in Romania, and I hope we won't see that.
Is it time, do you believe, and does your government believe, for NATO to go back to its constitution? Is it time for a rewriting in order to accommodate the threats of today?
No, I think we need to decide how do we want to react to Russian threats. For example, what Pavel said, it's really good because we do not reply with the same coin, let's say, yes? And take a look, for example, what happened in 2014 in Crimea when Putin invaded Crimea. Our response as NATO countries, our response as the Western, how they call us, was basically weak, in my opinion. We were just having statements that saying we are concerned about that, and now Crimea is a part of Russia, whether we like it or not. And everybody dealt with that.
And maybe I should then bring in one of the other questions here from someone in the audience, and perhaps you can all pick up on this. But the question here is, while it's important to identify the lessons from Ukraine since 2022, which we have reflected on, has Europe learned the lessons from 2014? This is State Secretary.
So I will continue my answer because I was coming to that as well. So I was referring to 2014 because, in my opinion, I think Putin just tested to see what was our reaction to that, and our reaction was a weak one, unfortunately. And maybe if we would have done what we did when the war started in Ukraine, when 3 years ago, we wouldn't be here. I don't know. That's a personal opinion. But I think we need to, and we learned. And the good, so-called good part of this war is that NATO became stronger than ever. Because before that, unfortunately, NATO was basically a bureaucratic institution. But after the invasion, I believe that this invasion brought us more closer and made us more stronger. And I think Putin didn't saw that coming. So that's why, for example, somebody said here, I don't remember who, that they are doing everything under the thin line, is because they know that NATO is a strong alliance, is a serious alliance, and the last 3 years made it more stronger.
And Dhesi, let me bring you in there. I mean, it's all well discussing lessons from 2022. Is it your view that these are lessons that were not learned in 2014?
Definitely. Look, I think we've moved on immensely. In 2014, the response was fairly tame. It was just a bunch of words saying, oh, this is really bad, this shouldn't have happened, you've got to stop, etc., etc. But there was no action behind that. And
a few sanctions.
Yeah, and that's, is a relatively tame response. 2022, since then, Europe, I think, has woken up, and now that has been accelerated with the boosters having been put forth because of what's happened with the new US administration. And now European nations are being asked to step up more to the plate, to spend more on defense. The UK has had to do that. And now I think with what's going to come about from NATO is not just, well, we're on the path, not just to 2.5, but to 3%. But I think we're going to be asked now collectively to go towards 5%. So 3.5% on military hardware, and then an extra 1.5%, whether it's in terms of intelligence, whether it's in terms of transport infrastructure, and so forth. So I think those lessons, to a great extent, have been learned, and I think that the response does need to be collective, because if at this point in time we don't treat this as a critical moment and we don't act in unity and solidarity, if European nations once again, for example, decide to put fisheries before defense and security, or they decide to exclude certain nations from collective action or the defense industrial base or defensive contracts, that's a really live argument that's being played out in the UK, whether it's in the media, whether it's in Parliament, where there's a feeling that, okay, the UK might be excluded from European defence contracts. Then I think that there will be diverging paths being forged rather than a collective path.
And that sounds like a call to the French government.
I wasn't going to mention any names, Rohit, but I'll leave it to you. I think I'll leave it there.
Let me bring in Nicole. Perhaps you want to pick up on that, but also to add on a broader point that we're talking, of course, about Russia here. That's our focus. But actually, hybrid warfare can come with all sorts of flags.
I think two points, and one just to build immediately off of yours, which is that our ability to operate in a meaningful way together, that's part of our superpower as democracies with shared values and shared interests and shared history. And so if we're able to do things such as Canada becoming a partner in Rearm Europe, that's incredibly powerful, where we can pool our resources together to create more of that unified front rather than all of us trying to do it separately. From our perspective, certainly Russia poses probably the most immediate military threat, but we continue to see the People's Republic of China as the largest strategic threat, where every single lever of state power is being used in a broader strategic attempt to advance their interests, quite frankly, at our collective expense.
And there are other countries as well. I mean, I wonder how you would contrast the Canadian experience against the People's Republic of China with that of, say, India, about which your previous Prime Minister was extremely vocal.
Well, I think it's even more than just those three countries in terms of the adversarial activities in the hybrid threat space. So from our perspective, I would very much include Iran in that as well, in terms of what we're seeing, and especially in the cyberspace in particular. But this also goes to calling out the threats when we see it. And Prime Minister Trudeau stood up in Parliament and told Canadians that there was intelligence that the government of India had been involved in the murder of a Canadian citizen on Canadian territory, and we call these things out.
Was there any reluctance to do that because you were talking about a democracy?
Well, I think part of it as well is that the world isn't black and white, and we can be in a position where we can have many shared interests, we can even have many shared values, but where a country still is pursuing certain activities that run counter to our particular interests. And I think some of the example you've just provided with India falls into that space. We can have complex, sophisticated relationships. It's not good and bad, and it's not the Cold War period. We're going to have to also get comfortable operating in a more sophisticated national security space with a lot of grey.
Elisabeth, would you agree?
I don't have much to add to the question about what we have learned since 2014, but I did want to add to something that you said earlier about attribution, and we can sort of have a philosophical conversation here about attribution, but where it really plays out is in the private sector, the operators of whatever is being targeted, and it is such a live and urgent and an acute situation. So if you look, for example, at S-Link 2, the interconnector between Finland and Estonia that was damaged by the Eagle S on Christmas Day. The bill for that, for the repair, is 60 million euros. That is not pocket change. And at the moment, Ellering and Fingrid, the two operators, are on the hook for the 60 million euros. And so they have to fight out with the insurers who should pay, but really it's neither. It ought to be whoever damaged the cable, but that's not how insurance and the private sector works, or that's not how our societies work. We have business operations and we have insurers who cover the risk. But what do we do when that risk turns into a systematic form of aggression by hostile states? Then certain parts of our society are at risk of becoming uninsurable because no private sector outfit, no insurer can take on that kind of risk. So this is where the debate is really carried out at great detail at the moment. So, for example, while we have this more general discussion about attribution and what constitutes an act of war, in the insurance space, in the critical national infrastructure space, that is where they have to decide what constitutes an act of war.
And briefly, Pavel, you're nodding along. I wonder if you have anything to add to that point.
I agree. Mm-hmm. I agree fully. And I have in my family some kids who are captains of boats. I mean, they are sailors of the tiny little boats. And when I spoke with them about the security of cables and connections, undersea connections, they explained me immediately that before getting papers, you have to pass exams. And one of the principal questions is that you avoid places where there is a undersea infrastructure. This is fundamentals. And we have to understand, we who do not have papers for sailing, that this breach of fundamental principles, be it for undersea infrastructure or elsewhere, is something that we should name and we should explain and we should base our reply on. Otherwise, we will not understand what is threatening and how serious the threat is.
Okay, so interesting to hear all of your insights. I'm just going to ask you all to stay in your seats because the program's going to continue right next with the next session on women, peace and geopolitics. But first of all, I want to thank all of our guests for traveling so far and for offering so much insightful analysis.